Hi, I'm Mark Madison, the historian at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And this afternoon, we're here with Rich Bailey, who is an ornithologist for the West Virginia Department of Natural Resources. And we're going to talk with Rich about the birds of West Virginia and beyond. So, Rich, welcome back. You were here a year ago. We had such a good time.
Had to come back.
Yeah, apparently you didn't have too horrible of time, so you agreed to come back. So we really appreciate it, Rich. It's wonderful to have you here.
Sure.
And I should mention you're here giving a talk this evening to the Potomac Valley Audubon Society.
Right, I am. Yeah, and one of my missions for my job and just because of interest is going around and talking to folks across the state and letting them in on the types of things that we're doing and doing education and outreach, talk about state of the birds and projects that we're working on in DNR and the Wildlife Resources section. So.
Great. So nobody better to have tell us about birds. But before we get to that, Rich, tell us a little about your job with the West Virginia DNR.
Well, I work for the Wildlife Diversity Unit, which is part of the Wildlife Resources section. If you looked at DNR, it's got various branches to it, I guess you could say, ranging from the state parks to game management to those of us that are in the Wildlife Diversity Unit. And specifically, I focus on research and conservation of non-game birds in the state. There's a game bird biologist that does a lot of work with turkey and grouse and stuff like that. But my main focus are rare, threatened, endangered birds, and also just basic research on bird populations and changes in distribution and status over time.
I didn't ask you this last time because it's kind of a personal question, but you come back a second time. You open yourself up to this. But out of curiosity, what does a typical day look like for an ornithologist?
That's a good question, and the answer is there really is no such thing as a typical day. It varies by season. In the wintertime, we're all doing a lot of planning. We're doing a lot of coordinating to get our work set up for what we call the field season. And a lot of my projects involve a lot of time in the field, generally from February to July or August. And that's when we're doing our research and taking a look at bird populations and traveling across the state to do the things that we do. But on any given day, I could be at the office working with mapping or boring stuff like database management. I could just as well be out in the field monitoring rare birds like Loggerhead Shrike or bald eagle, stuff like that. I could be what I'm doing tonight, presenting to groups and anything in between.
I'm glad we caught you in the off season. It sounds like it's going to ramp up very quickly.
Very soon. Eagles are the first to come up, and actually next week I'm going to be in the field looking at nesting eagles.
For those of us that are just amateur birders or maybe not avid birders at all, how do you monitor the birds? Are you doing it from a vehicle? Are you doing it from a blind? I mean, maybe it varies.
It varies hugely, and that's because birds do different things. Different birds do different things, and we're looking for different things with various species. With birds like bald eagles, for example, we're really clearly trying to take a look at nesting populations and breeding populations. Where are the birds nesting? When do they start nesting? What's their breeding success? How many young are they fledging in a given year? And how does that average out over the course of many years? And how does their distribution change over time? In the case of eagles, their populations are going up greatly. There are other birds that we obviously take a look at, ranging from peregrine falcons to loggerhead shrikes to a really threatened songbird called the golden-winged warbler. And it just depends on the species, what we do. It could be that I'm driving in my car, on a reclaimed strip mine, and all I'm doing is listening. I'm listening for singing birds and noting how many I'm hearing. It could be monitoring nests. It could be walking in the woods and just noting all the birds that I'm hearing. So
I think a lot of us are wishing we had your job right now. Although I'm sure
it's a wonderful job.
Yeah.
It's wonderful to be out in the field and all the work in the winter months is worthwhile when we get outside. So.
Cool. You've mentioned eagles a couple times.
Yeah,
so we should talk about eagles because we have a big eagles nest on campus here.
Right.
It's been here, I think, 7 years or so with two different males, and they just laid one egg not too long ago. For that eagle's nest, I mean, would you actually be tracking that in the state office? Let me ask you this: are there so many eagles you you don't know where every eagle is in
Where
West
are
Virginia?
all the eagles in the
Yeah, I
state?
mean, how many are in the state, and how do you monitor them? Do you rely on other people to?
So there's a lot of state, and there's not a lot of wildlife
Right.
biologists, right? So
Right.
how do you get around that?
Yeah.
And obviously it runs the whole gamut from reports that we get, just hearsay. People call and say during the right time of year, gosh, I saw adult bald eagle, and we start to think, if we get more than one of those observations, we start to think, well, maybe there's a nest in the area. Then we'll go and take a closer look. If we see birds, we might spend time trying to identify where that nest is, and from there we'll get a GPS coordinate of the nest, and we'll add it to our database, and then we'll actually visit the nest a couple times just to gauge how successful the nest is. Now, you guys here at NCTC do all of our work for us, because
Glad we could help.
not every bald eagle nest has a nice camera on it where you
Right.
can kind of take a look and see what's going on a minute by minute basis. But so it's great. We can judge how many birds fledge out and whatnot. What our real interest, though, is how things are changing over time for eagles. Back in the early 80s, we only knew of a single nest in the state, and it was actually in the eastern panhandle. And now we're well over probably 40 nests in the state. And if I had to hazard a guess, we know probably about half or 2/3 of the nests that are in the state. There are areas that are very hard to survey and very hard to get a really good sense. Down in the New River Gorge area, for example, we have at least one nest down there that we know of, but there certainly are probably more. We just don't know where they are, and so it's kind of an ongoing task, a detection, to try to find where they are.
So if there were up to 80, if you identified half, or between 60 and 80, how many nests could West Virginia's habitat support?
That's a really good question, and that's a question that I honestly probably couldn't answer for you. I would say quite a bit more than we have, and the reason I say that is almost every year I should say, we're finding nests in new locations. And so in a general sense, they started off in the eastern panhandle counties, and there really are quite a few birds in the eastern panhandle region of the state now, almost to the point, I would say, where we're getting to the point where there's most of the habitat is filled up. Eagles require a certain amount of territory. Their nests are almost always located relatively close to water, within a half mile, say, of water. And so if there's limited water resources, between lakes and rivers and stuff like that, you're going to eventually reach a point where you max out with that. But then there are parts of the state, there are these large lakes like Burnsville Lake, Stonewall Jackson Lake, where currently we don't have nesting eagles, but that we probably should expect that we would. Along the Greenbrier River, along the kind of the central eastern part of the state, we noted a nest in the last couple years. So they're expanding, and particularly along the Ohio River as well.
Yeah.
So it's only a matter of time, probably, before, unless something else comes up that otherwise would negatively impact their populations to where all these places should have eagles.
Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
It probably explains why we had an interloper last year
Right,
drive out
right.
our male eagle, and now
Right.
he's taken over the nest, probably killed.
Yeah, and if you have this upward trend, you're going to have dispersing young that are looking for a place to nest, and there can be conflict between resident eagles and eagles that are flying around looking for a place to nest and breed. And when that happens, you'll have conflicts like that.
So they're a territorial type?
They are territorial, yeah, but very, very much so during the breeding season.
When is the breeding season for eagles?
Generally speaking, in West Virginia, even as early as mid-January, there's nest maintenance going on. There's nest building going on. February is kind of the month for where we really start to see birds sitting on eggs. And by the time late May or early June rolls around, we have, and if a nest is successful, we'll have very large, developed, young ready to fledge and fly out of the nest.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
How many eggs do eagles normally lay?
That really depends on how productive their site is, right? And often you can gauge, how productive a habitat is, how much food birds are getting by their clutch size. If you averaged out how many eggs birds are producing, year to year, you can see if it's on the upper end. Birds are producing a lot of eggs. That might mean they're getting a lot of food. Otherwise, it's good habitat. Obviously, it varies by species. But with eagles, generally speaking, 1 to 3. With 3 being quite unusual, I would say, between 1 and 2 if you average it out as the norm. But then, of course, there are also nests that fail. For whatever reason they're not successful. So.
We're going to take advantage just a little more of your expertise because we set up a eagle cam. But I'm curious with a ornithologist here. What should people be looking at? I mean, normally what I see in classrooms and so on is they flip it on, they're like, there's an eagle. I don't even necessarily know if it's a male or female eagle. And then they watch it a while and flip it off. But are there things that in different seasons they could be observing that might be interesting about eagles?
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting during the nesting season, particularly with an eagle cam. It's just really interesting watching their activities and what they're doing, from nest maintenance to rolling the egg to better distribute heat to brooding after the nestlings have hatched. They need to be brooded and kept warm for a certain period of time. You can watch eagles come in and out of the nest. They can feed each other. If a female is on eggs, the male will come and bring food to her. All these really interesting behaviors. And of course, here, what happened just a little while ago here at NCTC with the interloping male, and you had this.
That was fairly dramatic.
Right.
Probably traumatic for some kids.
and yeah, it can be. And you know, what people most often don't know about eagles, though, in terms of their food habits, is it's not just that eagles don't just eat fish, and even though during the breeding season that's kind of the bulk of their diet. You know, they're bringing fish to the nest, particularly in the off season when they're not breeding, and you have a wintering population of bald eagles here. They actually will range far and wide looking for food, and that ranging can go well away from water. And so sometimes people will call me and be really surprised. They're driving down a country lane and they look just by the side of the road, and there's a deer that got hit by a car or something, and there's an eagle sitting on the side of the road eating on that deer, and they're like, gosh, I never thought of a bald eagle doing something like this. But you know, they're really adaptable birds, and in the non-breeding season you can see them just about anywhere in the state, and we often get a lot of calls. And of course, in wintertime we get birds in the state that are actually coming from the north to winter, and places, there are places in the state like Kimsey Run Lake in Hardy County, which is a really popular spot to go and watch eagles. And I think there have been reports of people seeing more than 15 eagles, at that lake at one time. So.
It raises a question. I get it, and I don't actually know how to answer it. I mean, are eagles a migratory species?
They are, yes.
Okay.
And tracking their movements can be a little tricky. Luckily, now we have technology where you can actually fit the birds with locators, and you can track their movements in real time. But particularly here in the kind of mid-Atlantic region, our birds might actually head south for the winter, but we might get birds from the north that are coming down and spending the winter in West Virginia. And in some cases, we also might have birds that don't go anywhere and they stick around. And it can depend on a lot of factors, from how much food's available to the age of the bird. The young are more likely to disperse and move regionally even. So. Yeah.
The nests look huge when they migrate.
Yeah.
Do they build another nest like that, or
during the winter months they're not building any nests at all. They're just simply foraging for food and trying to make it through the winter. To be honest, but these long-term pairs usually associate with each other across years, and usually they're monogamous. So for many years you'll have these stable pairs. But oftentimes the same nest is reused year to year, or once a pair is successful in an area, if say a storm comes and the tree gets blown down and they lose their nest, they'll build a new one, often generally in a similar location. But they'll even in the winter months you'll see them maintaining that nest, particularly once January rolls around.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, you really have filled in a lot for our Eagle Cam. We might have to run a little video clip of this
right.
on the Eagle Cam, because we do get a lot of questions, and it's been a great outreach.
As do we. It's one of those birds that everyone loves, and most people aren't aware that we actually have two species of eagles that can be found in the state too, and some people will report seeing a golden eagle as well in the wintertime particular,
okay.
and they'll see this massive dark bird.
Right.
I didn't think that an eagle was dark like that, but we do have golden eagles too. So.
That's fascinating. Well, as you mentioned, you've been studying bald eagles for a while, the state has, and they've come back fairly robustly. That's been kind of a success story.
It is a success story, yes.
But a lot of your job, I imagine, is dealing with birds that are more threatened and not doing as well. You mentioned a couple earlier. Tell us a little about the Loggerhead Shrike.
Well, Loggerhead Shrike is just a fascinating bird, and most people have maybe heard of shrikes at one point or another in their lives, but they can't really visualize what even a shrike looks like. And a shrike is actually, just really simply put, a songbird that hunts. It's a predatory songbird. And most people think of, imagine a cardinal-sized bird that actively will hunt prey like mice and even other small birds. They'll eat baby snakes and frogs and all kinds of other interesting things. And it's this predatory songbird that's really a bird of open country. We think of it as a grassland or savanna bird, and it's not a bird that you're going to see except exceptionally rarely in the woods, for example. And it looks very similar to a mockingbird. Most people are familiar with the gray and white and mockingbird that people commonly see in your yards, and it sings this repetitive song. But a shrike is much more rare, and it's almost like a mockingbird with a black bandit mask or a ninja mask on its face. And it has a really interesting adaptation that kind of enables it to hunt, because it's not a bird of prey, and it doesn't have talons like a bird of prey. It actually has to adapt to that, and what it does is it takes prey that it catches, like mice or a lot of insects, and it actually will impale its prey on features of farms like barbed wire fences, on the actual barbed wire. So one of the ways that we actually look for shrikes is we drive along a road, and I'm sitting there driving really slowly, and I'm looking at the fence line, and I'm looking for things that are actually strung up on that barbed wire fence. But it's not just barbed wire fences that have these barbs. We're really looking for cow pastures and stuff that have plants like honey locust or hawthorn or something like these really long thorns on it. And so they're very specific in terms of their habitat. And when you think of grassland or farm, you think, gosh, we have tons of farms in particular parts of the state. Why wouldn't there be lots of shrikes? And I should say that shrikes used to be common. Now they're exceptionally rare. If I had to guess, I'd say we have between 10 and 20 pairs of shrikes in the entire state right now. But you think that their habitat's common. You talk about that, but when you start to look at it more closely, what you're looking for is number one, a farm that's a good size. It's not a really tight farm surrounded by trees, and not only that, it's a farm that's used as pasture. There's almost always cows on that farm, but then you think, well, gosh, there's lots of that. But if you look at a lot of pasture land and farms now, what you see is basically a fence line, and then there's just nothing but grass all the way across that farm to the other side, and there's another fence, and it's what we call a clean farm. And shrikes really like it the way that we used to farm, or what I would call heritage farming. And these are farm fields that have that grass, and they have cows, but they also have scattered shrubs or trees, and these shrubs, hopefully have thorns in them. And you start to look for this shrike habitat, and you realize very quickly that it's really a rare type of habitat, and it's very uncommon. And there are parts of the state where we have more of that habitat, and as you might guess, in those areas are where we have our remaining shrikes. And the Greenbrier Valley of West Virginia is one of those places, for example. So what we're doing at DNR is we're really trying to take a close look at not only identifying the habitat and identifying where these birds are. We're actually now at a point where we have more shrike habitat than we have birds to fill it up, which means that there's something else going on with shrikes. It's not just that they're being limited by their habitat. They're not finding suitable places to breed. Something else is driving the decline, and we don't actually really know what that is. We're thinking about taking a closer look at winter mortality. In other words, during the breeding season, the birds might be doing okay, but what's happening to them in the winter? Is there a cause of mortality in the winter that's meaning that basically come spring, there's just fewer birds each year to breed and replace, just normal year-to-year losses.
There's so few, are they having a hard time finding mates?
Well, that's
maybe an ignorant question.
Well, that's a good question, right? Sometimes you're driving along and you just see a single shrike, and you see a single shrike, and you're not seeing pairs, and that's that's something that we're very curious about. And I think the answer is absolutely yes. In some cases, that probably is happening. And there are parts of this, the parts of the state, again, like the Greenbrier Valley, where the habitat's much more stable in terms of its persistence year to year. Farmers like to clear out their farm fields, and particularly with the new farming practices that people use, they think it looks unsightly to have a shrubby, messy, old, and so inadvertently they're removing shrike habitat. But even so, in the Greenbrier Valley, the habitat is more secure. But still, there's something going on.
You've told a great story, and this is really helpful for us too, because we work with a lot of endangered species.
Right, right.
And the cause of decline are never the same from one to another.
Not at all, right.
But so you've told this amazing story of decline and this specialized feeder and so on.
Right.
What can you do as a state agency
Right.
to add more habitat or
Right.
to help them?
And
at this
that's
point,
one of
after the study is done.
Right, right. And one of the things that we kind of agonize a little bit over is it's not, ultimately it's not enough to just monitor the decline of a species. We're tracking population changes. You ideally you're taking it the next step, and you're saying, okay, what types of things could be on the plate to slow the decline of the species, or hopefully stabilize things, so that you can then start to think about it. And the first step here is, it's kind of a tiered process for us. First is identifying the population. How many birds do we actually have, and where are they? And that's where things like monitoring and survey, come into play. The second thing is, okay, we've got this, but we've got this population, but we don't know a whole lot about it. And so the next step is really getting research going on the ground. And there are so many questions pertaining to shrikes, but it's working with partners like West Virginia University, sure. Perhaps even across states. We're starting to think about working with neighboring states on this problem. But to get grad students on the ground, to assist them to try to even if there's grant funds, other means of support that we can provide to start answering these questions. In the case of shrikes, taking a look at winter mortality, or taking a look at the genetics of our population, sure. Trying to gauge basic natural history questions, describing the habitat that they're using. And so, once you really start to have good answers to these questions, you can start to then translate that understanding into active on the ground management, and that means partnering with private landowners almost always. In West Virginia, there's a lot of public land, but it's almost all forest land, and so you really have to partner with private landowners, and a number of avenues to do that, ranging from working perhaps through the NRCS, for example, or land trusts, or trying to find a way to incentivize landowners directly with DNR if we're able to find the financial resources to do so. Luckily, with shrikes, it's really a farm-friendly bird, and there's very little management that you could do to drastically improve a farm for shrikes. It's doing education and outreach. It's actually getting on the ground with landowners and talking with them and asking them really important questions. What would it take for you to do this? How could we help? And we've got to go through these steps. And right now we're in step one still with shrikes, and our concern is ultimately, are we going to get through those steps in time? Another idea that's been done that we're not sure that we want to do, but that we're talking about or thinking about, is what they've been doing in Ontario with their loggerhead shrikes, which is thinking about what might be involved with a captive breeding and release program. One thing that we've noted is the few pairs of shrikes that we have don't seem to be fledging out a lot of young, and so what we might do is actually go to identify active nests and remove eggs, and go and captive raise those birds, and then hack them, what we call hacking, adjusting, making them accustomed to habitat again, and then releasing them back into the habitat. There's a lot of hurdles to cross with that. There's funding issues, there's permitting issues. So we'd have to have a really well thought out plan that was also really well backed by research. And so, but ultimately, if it's a bird that we want to keep on our landscape, it might be something we have to do.
It's a great story.
Yeah.
Well, you work for the West Virginia DNR.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little about some of the challenges birds might face in this state.
Right, in a general sense. Huh?
Yeah, and one people who aren't from West Virginia might not be aware of would be the number of wind farms we actually have in West Virginia.
Sure.
Does that cause a lot of problems with birds, or not?
It causes problems for birds, but not necessarily in the ways that people might think.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of concern with wind farms and diurnal raptors, for example, and we're doing research to, or I should say we, but my peers and colleagues across these are doing research to take a look at this problem. You know, what are the migration routes of raptors? They're migrating during the day. You've got these big obstacles. Yeah. A lot of times these raptors will follow these leading ridges on their way, you know, on migration. And so, you know, what's the risk? What's the mortality? And that's being looked at.
Diurnally, they can't see them?
Well, they can see them, but sometimes these blades are cutting extremely fast. Okay. But you know, again, it's something that we haven't entirely fleshed out, so we're not sure. What we can say is that there's some mortality. We just don't, we quantifying that mortality is something that's ongoing. But then there are a lot of birds that migrate at night as well, and particular songbirds are coming through at night. And so you think that these obstacles would and these blades would really cause a lot of mortality. But what we find even during migration is that even though there is mortality associated with these wind farms, mortality, you know, per nacelle, per tower is not very high under good conditions, under good migration conditions, and usually the flight altitude of these songbirds actually it means that they're actually flying above the elevation of the tops of these turbines. Now, what can happen, and where we've seen mortality events, is kind of a confluence of a number of different factors. Particularly in fall, you can have these bad weather conditions with low visibility, this kind of whiteout where you have these systems that basically create a you know, fog, really dense fog, or otherwise force birds lower to the ground. And in those conditions, what we found that's really just hugely bad for migrating songbirds is light on the ground, particularly on ridges. And so where we've had problems here in West Virginia, and we've had bird mortality events. We had one at a high school in Tucker County. We had one at a wind farm on Laurel Mountain, in actually near where I live in Elkins. And in both cases, there was light on the ground that actually trapped the birds. And by trapped, I mean, normally when a bird is migrating at night, and this is what we think, you're flying, say I'm a bird and I'm flying, the sky above is actually lighter than the because of the stars, whatever, than the dark ground below. But when birds are forced down like this, not only does fog really scatter light and create this diffuse light, but it actually inverts their horizon, meaning that all of a sudden it's lighter below and darker above. So the birds get disoriented, and when that happens, they'll start to circle or fly around these lights, and that's when you have impact mortality. Really tall TV towers that are over 400 feet or so can be you know, the most damaging, and you can in some cases lose thousands of birds in a single night.
So something you can do to stop them?
Turn the lights off. Okay. and that's what we're working. And so
then
a lot
do
of
the planes hit them, or I assumed on a tower, and so on the flashing lights are just
right. And so what we notice, steady burning lights in particular are the worst. If you have blinking lights, you have strobe lights that can be much better. So there are things that you can do to minimize mortality. You're always going to have mortality associated with these facilities, but it's you know, it's minimizing the large source mortality where you have a single event that will, you know.
Well, that's fascinating, Rich.
But one of the
once
things.
Again, you've added some nuance to our.
Yeah, well, I mean, I won't profess to be a total expert in this, but it's something that we've noticed, and from the literature, that's what we understand that it suggests. One of my biggest concerns with this, perhaps even more than this, because we really can mitigate the lighting issue to a large degree, is just simple habitat fragmentation. Yeah. You're taking a ridge that was you know, a large forested block of land, and you're you know, basically chopping off the top of it, you know, putting in a wind farm. You're actually kind of dividing those forest blocks into smaller fragments, basically. And when you do that, you're creating an abundance of edge habitat, which brings in its own suite of birds. Right. But you know, we have a big concern with what we call forest interior birds, these birds that need large tracts of forest land. And while you still, even after the wind facility is in place, you still might have these birds breeding on the, you know, in the forest that remains. There's a what we call brood parasite called the brown-headed cowbird that can really impact the interior forest. And so they might actually start moving up these corridors that are created by these wind farms. It's something that needs to be studied. The same goes for Marcellus gas development, for example. You're starting to create this increasingly fragmented landscape, and it starts to make us pretty concerned about certain bird species.
Another thing West Virginia is known for is coal.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Mountaintop removal almost certainly isn't going to be good for the birds, but I wonder when restoration is done on these sites, when they're replanted and so on, is there guidance you can give them to try to make the restoration more effective?
There are guidelines in place, or suggestions, I should say, for reclamation, and we have folks in the state that work on reclamation, and
does that affect the birds in the same way, like you just said, with fragmentation? And so on?
Well, certainly you have this really large scale habitat alteration going on, particularly in the southwest part of the state, in places like Boone or Logan counties, and you're simply losing a lot of forest cover, and that's absolutely going to affect again these forest interior birds. One that we have concern about in this state, but also there's a great amount of concern about it generally, is the cerulean warbler, which believe it or not, has its highest breeding densities in West Virginia and kind of in surrounding states, in Ohio and Kentucky. And so this bird certainly is impacted by mountaintop removal mining. But there's a good question: what happens when you have this arrested, what we call arrested succession of these reclaimed mines, and in effect you have these grassland habitats that are very stable over many years? What's happening there, and what birds are coming in?
And put the shrikes there.
Right? Could the shrikes be on?
Right.
And in a lot of cases, we have challenges with access. In other words, getting on these sites to actually do bird survey. Not only is it a remote and difficult part of the state, but this is a very large parcels of private land. But what we do know is that some things that are interesting have been noted, and that we do have some grassland bird species that seem to be increasingly utilizing these grasslands that are created from mine reclamation. And in some cases, these are bird species that are declining overall, that we increasingly have a concern about. One is a bird called a grasshopper sparrow, for example, and one of the things we're noting in recent years with the bird atlas that I'm working on, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, is that we're noting that grasshopper sparrows are increasingly utilizing these sites, and there's been some work done in other states like Pennsylvania have taken a look at they're moving into these sites. Are they being productive? Are they serving as sources for these populations, or are they getting to these sites and thinking that they look like good habitat, but finding that they're not producing young, they're not producing a lot of insect biomass that the birds would be eating? And so that's a subject for ongoing research. Some evidence suggests that in the case of the grasshopper sparrow and perhaps some others, it actually might be a good thing. These might serve as areas to as reservoirs for the population.
So winners and losers.
Right. Yeah, and in general, there are winners and losers. But if you asked me, are we looking at a loss of overall bird biodiversity and to these sites? I would say we are dealing with some losses, particularly with interior forest species. So,
well, you alluded to it.
Yeah.
The very fascinating bird breeding atlas. Tell us a little about this project, because it's pretty exciting.
It pretty much encompasses all of my time, and it's something that's done every 20 to 25 years, just depending on state. And most states now have completed a breeding bird atlas. West Virginia's first breeding bird atlas was conducted and completed in 1989. And in a fundamental sense, what it is exactly what it sounds like. We're trying to identify the distribution of all breeding birds in the state. And some breeding birds, like, I don't know, the American robin, is going to be found almost everywhere in the state. And so if you look at a map of the state and there's dots on the map, the entire state's going to be covered with robins just about. There's some bird species though, in the case of the second atlas that we're working on now, called the species being the upland sandpiper, we have a single pixel on the map, and there's only one place that we know of where it's bred in the last number of years. And so atlases take 5 to 6 years to complete. And in the case of West Virginia, we're taking 6 years for the first atlas and for this atlas. And we're in the going into the 5th year out of 6 on the second atlas, and we're just noticing all kinds of fantastic and amazing, and in some cases depressing things. But overall, it's just fascinating to really map out where these birds are and how they, more importantly, how are they changing over time.
Yeah.
That's why you do these. You have these 20, 25 year increments of time between atlases. You're noticing changes in the distribution of species, and particularly in the face of climate change, and how things are changing overall. We're noting some things that are really interesting. We can't necessarily peg it to climate change. That there's and most people will tell you that it takes a lot of work and research to definitively say that climate change is causing something. But we do notice these changes in species, and some birds are increasing. We are already telling that, even though we're not done with the atlas. There are some changes both for the good and for the bad. And one of the things that we're doing differently with this atlas is where there's a second added component. We're not just tracking where these birds are, but we're actually counting how many birds are there, and we're actually getting what we call an abundance estimate and an estimate of relative abundance. There's some complex statistics that goes into that because we're doing sampling. We obviously can't sample the entire bird population of the state, but we're noticing some fascinating things.
Where can people see the bird atlas?
Well, we've got a website. We have two websites. The first website is kind of an informational website for birders and others who are interested in maybe contributing to the project, and we're always seeking help with that. And I always go to pains to say you don't need to be one of these people that's walking in the woods, and you don't even need to see the birds. You're hearing them, and you can identify every bird that's in the woods. We're happy with birds you're seeing in your yard. That's it. You don't, as long as you're sure of the bird that you see, that's fine. But we have an information website for folks that can go and learn more about the process. We also have a second website that is hosted with Cornell, and that's the actual data portal. Where do you go to enter the birds you see? And there's a whole process to it, but we try to make it easy. You just go online and you set up an account with this website, and you can actually enter these birds in and where they're at, and it works very well. And really, really nice is it also has a data exploration function to it, where you can look at maps of the state. You can, and kind of ongoing year to year to year, you can see the map fill in or not for certain species, and you can then compare it to the first atlas. And so with the case of a bird that's really increasing, like bald eagle, which we talked about earlier, you can see bald eagle in the first atlas there's 1 or 2, and now it's the map's filling up. Take common raven, for example, our smartest and largest songbird is increasing, and you can notice a definite increase from the first atlas. And then you can contrast that, of course, with birds that are not doing so well too.
Sounds great. Are there some other striking things you've noticed in your work on this atlas?
Yeah, I mean, there are some really neat things we've noticed in terms of birds breeding for the first time. There were birds there are species that are completely absent from the state as breeders in the first atlas that are now actually relatively common in the right parts of the state. One of those is common merganser, for example. Really? This very large duck is just is now here, and it wasn't at all. This past year, we documented our first confirmed record of northern harrier breeding in the state. Wow. And there are other neat examples like that. But then on the unfortunate side as well, we're really noticing some drastic declines in species like the golden-winged warbler, for example. We can track it with the shrikes. Other songbirds are increasing, like yellow-throated warbler is increasing in the state, and then there's some that really seem to be stable. And so we're really looking forward to having that finished data set and can really dig into it and try to parse out and start to think about what's going on and what's changing, and through that the things that you can really do with a finished atlas is really start to more than answer questions, ask questions or guide research. And through that guide management, are there birds on our rare, threatened, endangered state list that perhaps are not on that list but need to be, or are there birds species on that list that we can go ahead and take off? Because they're doing great. Yeah.
All right, we're almost out of time, so I got to ask you one last question.
Sure
because it's why you're here, and that's doing, like you said before, part of your job is education and outreach.
Right.
And I'd like to focus it in just a little on youth. Have you had success speaking to younger people and getting them interested in the birds of West Virginia?
We have, and you know, we all within a diversity unit we have different focuses, and my focus is really kind of honed in on research and actually, you know, field work and working with volunteers to do that. But we engage and actively try to engage with groups like Boy Scouts, for example, or actually, you know, going into the classroom. We have an education outreach specialist in DNR that does a lot of that. And we have events like hunting and fishing days where we have a lot of down at Stonewall Jackson. We have a lot of kids come in, and we're all there and we're all talking about birds. One of the things that I you know try to impress upon people again is that, you know, to really do meaningful research in the state, you don't have to have this, you know, encyclopedic knowledge of birds. And one of the things that I'm working on, kind of trying to reach out to teachers and just about anyone else in the state, is there's certain birds that I'm really interested in that are really declining, that we really need to know about, that almost everyone recognizes. One that I really like to point out is the whippoorwill.
Yep.
You know, this iconic bird of farm and field and forest that
whose song is very recognizable.
Yes, just repetitive.
Yeah.
But what everyone will tell you in the state, you know, just about most places, is, gosh, I used to hear a lot more whippoorwills. Now I'm only hearing one or two, or I'm not hearing them anymore. Back when I was a kid, they were just filling up everywhere in the state. And so, you know, particularly I'm trying to engage with the scouts and others to, you know, go out at night during the right time of year and listen for whippoorwills and report back to me. And you know,
is that the best way to identify birds, via song or via sight?
Well, you know,
Depends on the
it depends
bird.
entirely on the bird species. Some birds are both secretive and silent, and that's a big problem, right? Some birds are visually secretive, but really will make a lot of noise. And so one of those birds, my favorite being a yellow-breasted chat, for example. And so you can use your ears for that. And some birds are silent, but are very, you know, prominent when you do see them. Shrike is a perfect example of that. They're incredibly rare, you know, but they'll just sit on power lines and sit still for long periods of time and just really leap out at you that they're there. You know, so it just depends entirely on the species. But by and large, for the research that I do, I'm doing a lot of birding by ear. I'm doing a lot of just, you know, most people think I might be there with my binoculars just looking, but a lot of times I'm looking down and I'm just using my ears and picking things up. You know, but you know, really engaging with youth and kids and other volunteers, you know, you can get them hooked by simple things like whippoorwills or you know, leading nature walks. I recently was down in Pocahontas County, and we dedicated a nature trail down there in the park. You know, just, you know, getting these kids out on that trail like that and just taking a look at the birds and even if they don't know the song, I say, you know, you're not going to walk away from this knowing every single song, but just listen to it. Listen to all the different types of songs. You know, focus less on the identification, but just on experiencing it. And, you know, kids get engaged with stuff like that. So
great.
Yeah.
Well, Rich, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, sure
We'll
thing.
let you get back to your primary duty, which is communicating with the public this evening. But we really appreciate you coming back. It was very educational and inspirational.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Good luck with the West Virginia birds, and maybe we'll get you back next year. So thanks a lot.
Hey, thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
And I'd like to thank all of you for taking time to watch this. And we'll be back again with a future broadcast with a fisheries biologist, just to give the entire natural world its due. So thank you very much.